Are you struggling with how to take sharp photos? In this video I'm going to show you the reasons your photos are blurry and how you can easily fix the problem. Hi, I'm Kim from Landscape to Art, and I'm here to help you improve your landscape photography with a focus on developing your skills as a photographer and less on the gear you use. And if this is your first time here, make sure you click the subscribe button below. Blurry or out of focus photos happens to every photographer, and it's frustrating when you have taken a supposedly great shot only to realize when you are back at the computer that the image is not as sharp as you expected. But before you blame yourself or blame your camera or lens, you must consider your own skills and camera techniques. I know this can be hard to accept, but blurry photos are almost always caused by the photographer. And this means buying a new and more expensive camera won't help you at all. When you photograph people or animals, the key is to make sure that the eyes are totally sharp. But in landscape photography, you typically want the whole image from the foreground to the background to be equally sharp. And as I will show you in this video, there are many things that you can, or many things that can cause blurry photos. So let's get started. There are basically two main reasons causing these problems. The first is movement, because the camera or the subject moves during the exposure. And the second reason is missed focus. And there is also a third reason, but to me it's less important, and that's about lens quality. So if you manage to get the two first right, your photos will be sufficiently sharp for most of the purposes. So first let's look at what happens when the camera moves during the exposure. The most obvious reason to suspect camera movement is that the whole image looks blurry. And the amount of blur might vary from barely visible to totally blurred and an unusable shot. When you use auto or aperture priority mode and the light is limited, the camera will typically select a longer shutter speed. And if you took the photo without a tripod, you should check which shutter speed the camera actually used. It is limited how long shutter speeds you can use when you handhold the camera. And as general rule of thumbs, when you handhold, the shutter speed should be equal to or exceed the focal length you're using. So let's say you're using a 50mm lens, then you should set the aperture, it should be faster than 1/50th of a second. And with a 150mm focal length, the shutter speed should be at least 1/150 seconds. Here is an example of an image where I totally overestimated my hand-holding capabilities. So this is the image here of the king penguins are taking on a very long distance, and actually I'm using a Nikon bridge camera, a P900 at 700mm, but my shutter speed here is 1/200th of a second, of course, and that's almost impossible to handheld. And you can see that this photo has a blur over it, and there is no single point here that are sharp. So and we can see it. I see it immediately when I look at the image that there is a camera movement that is causing this error. And according to the thumb of rule, I should have shot at least 1/700th of a second or even faster to make sure of a sharp image. So a good example of not being able to keep the camera steady during the shot. Most cameras in 2020 have some variations of built-in image stabilization, and this makes it possible to handhold with shutter speeds as long as 4 or 5 stops longer than the rule of thumbs I just mentioned. But how long shutter speeds you can get away with also depends on your hand-holding technique. So in general, to avoid blurry photos in low light situation, I always recommend using a tripod. The second type of movement is subject movement. And when only a part of the image is blurred and the rest is sharp, it indicates that there are some elements in the frame that have moved during the exposure. And this can be things like water, grass, flowers, trees, or even leaves on trees. If any of these elements are unintentionally blurred, you have used a too long shutter speed for the scene. And to freeze the movement, you must increase the shutter speed. And how much you need to increase the shutter speed, of course, depends on how much movement there is in the subjects. These yellow flowers here, it's a typical example of a too long shutter speed. So the flowers was moving. It was kind of breeze in the air. So, and you can see these parts of the flowers are moving faster, and other parts are less blurred, whereas the rest of the image here is sharp, even the grass in the foreground here. So this is a typical example of subject movement. So if I wanted to freeze all the flowers there from being blurred, I had to increase the shutter speed. I need to use a faster shutter speed. And here's another example. I took this in Vietnam, and more or less the only thing here that's sharp is the bananas here. They are hanging still, and of course everything, the buildings and the sign here in the background. Even this guy here, he's standing still reading the paper. All the other people here are moving, they are working, so they are blurred, and even the car and buses. So this girl here in red, she's probably standing still, so she looks sharp in the image. This is also an example of subject movement, and in this example here, it's taken at 1/6 of a sec. No, sorry, it's taken at 1/13th of a second at 29 millimeters. So it's such a long shutter speed. 1/13th of a second is quite a long shutter speed in photography, and that makes these people here and everything that is in motion blurry. And here is another example. This car here is even if it's coming towards me, it's still blurred because the shutter speed is about, it's 1/15th of a second. And the photo is taken at 200 millimeters, but I'm on a tripod, so everything else is totally sharp. Only the car that is moving towards me has this blur, and I of course I did it intentionally. You can of course choose if you want to create blur intentionally, or if the blur happens when you don't expect it or want it, you need to consider the shutter speed. Out of the two mistakes I have just mentioned, camera movement is the most common factor causing blurry photos. Next, let's look at focus problems. So how can you distinguish blurry photos due to movement from photos that are not entirely sharp because of missed focus? The easiest way is to look at the focus plane, the distance from the lens to the focus point. When the camera has focused on a given point, everything at the same distance from the lens, no matter if it's to the left or to the right in the composition, will be as sharp. So if there are any areas in an image that are sharp, you can exclude camera movement. So here's an example. In this image of the seal, we can see his head is not in focus. But if I look, there is a stream here that are sharp. So if I zoom in on this rock here, you can see this area here in this photo is totally sharp, and also on the other side there are some elements here that are sharp. So it means that the camera focused on these areas, and of course they are behind the seal, so that makes him look blurry. So this is a missed focus. So if I look at I tried it again, of course, and now if I zoom in on the little rock here, you can see it's blurred. But now the head of the seal is in focus. This is typically what happens when you are on auto focus and the camera, let the camera decide where to focus. In landscape photography, in most situations, the goal is to take images that are sharp from the foreground to the background. And this can be challenging at times, and in particular if you have elements very close to the lens. Foreground to background focus is not only depending on the focus distance, but But also factors like aperture, depth of field, and camera to subject distance plays an important role as well. Getting the focus right in landscape photography is a whole topic in itself. So I have made another video covering this, and you can click on the link on my side up here and watch that video if you like. Another and more basic focus mistake is selecting the wrong focus point or using wrong focus mode on your camera. If your camera is set to autofocus, there will always be a risk that the camera will select a focus point that is not where you want to focus, like I just showed you in the image. Here is another example. These snowy cheetbill birds are of course out of focus, and we can see why, because my camera focused on the foreground here, on the rocks. And that's of course not what I intended. So again, I missed the focus because the camera selected the wrong areas. So what I should have done here is to make a single focus point and point them to one of the birds, to the eyes of the bird. If there is something like tree branches sticking into the composition, you risk that the camera will pick up this item and branch and focus on that instead. Here is another example. In this image, the seal puppy's face is not totally sharp, and because the focus is actually here on the grass in the foreground. So I took another photo, and now you can see the eyes and the whiskers are sharp, and at the same time the foreground is now out of blur, so this blurry, so the grass now is out of focus, whereas the seal is sharp. But in complex scenes that typically landscapes are, the safest is to switch to manual focus and use the focusing ring on the lens. And this way you have full control over where you set the focus. As you will see in the other video I just mentioned, to get the focus sharp from foreground to background, you cannot focus on the closest element or the mountains in the background. You have to focus somewhere in between. And your camera has no clue that is what you want, so your only option is to take control and focus manually yourself. There is another reason that can cause images not to look perfectly sharp, and more advanced photographers refer to this as soft images. And soft images are related to the quality of the lens. It is a minor problem and nothing you should really be concerned about if you are early in your photography journey. But if you perfectly master the other things I have discussed in this video so far, as a next step you might want to look into quality of your lenses. But generally the more expensive a lens is, the sharper it is, and it doesn't even stop there. In addition, all lenses have a sweet spot, which is the aperture where the lens is at its sharpest. And on most lenses, these are apertures in the range of f8 or to f11. Lenses are science, and if you want to dig deep into this, you can read the ExoMark charts until your eyes are wet. I never studied one myself, and I don't think doing it will ever make me or improve my photography. Also, I have no intention of making huge prints, which might be the only time anything of what I've just mentioned really makes a difference. So to conclude, if only parts of the image are blurred, you should consider subject movement or missed focus point as the cause of the problem. If the whole image is blurry, it's likely one of the two following reasons: camera movement or camera completely failed to focus. It will take some practice to learn all these things, but over time you will get better and better. Only when you identify and take actions on your mistakes, you will be able to learn from them. And remember, failures are what makes you a better photographer. So now, if you like this video, consider giving it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And thank you so much for watching, and as usual, if you have any comments or questions, post them in the comment section below. And until next time, ha det bra, goodbye.